Good morning, everyone, and Happy New Year. I love saying Happy New Year. I think, like so many of you, I'm particularly excited about this new year, about 2021. It holds a lot of promise, doesn't it? At the same time, I'm grateful for all the gifts we've received in 2020. Despite its many hardships, despite despair and the appearance of disease, I'm very grateful for it. And what I'm most grateful for is the ample time in solitude it delivered to me. And maybe the same was true for many of you. And it gave me time for spiritual renewal, time for reflection, reassessment, and a reevaluation of what I most desired. So even though I was unemployed, it didn't scare me because I was receiving this incredible gift, these insights. And the answers I received about what my true desires were actually surprised me. And I found myself returning to my earliest ambitions as a schoolgirl. I was born in Hohokus, New Jersey, and I was raised in a Catholic community. I went to all girls Catholic schools from the time I was 6. And the nuns had a very powerful influence on me. They were kind and loving and very nurturing, although some of you might not have had that experience, I've heard. But I had that experience. And when I was very young, about 6 years old, 7 years old, I decided I wanted to be a nun. Don't laugh. And I didn't really know what that meant. I just knew that the women that I most admired, my teachers, were nuns, and they had given me so much, and I wanted to be like them. And when I told one of the nuns, Sister Doreen, that I wanted to be a nun, she said, "Oh, you want to be a bride of Christ?" And that really ignited my imagination. Bride of Christ, wow. And I went home and I told my mom I was going to be a bride of Christ. And I told her that I was going to walk down the aisle wearing a beautiful white dress next to an invisible man named Jesus. And he was going to be my invisible husband for the rest of my life. And of course, things changed a little bit. But those nuns inspired me. They taught me a longing for God, or they made me realize, rather, a longing for God that had always been there from the time I was born. A great desire to possess and be possessed by God. And so I turned to that again during my time of solitude during the pandemic. And I remembered some of the stories that the nuns had inspired me with. They told me incredible stories of saints and mystics in the Catholic tradition. And one of my favorites was Saint Catherine of Siena, Italy. And perhaps many of you have heard of her or heard of her stories. She was a patron saint of Europe. And what's so interesting is that, similar to us, she lived during a pandemic. Except her pandemic, I believe, was far worse. It was called the Black Death, the Black Plague. And it took 50 million lives. And they didn't have masks then, designer masks with pretty colors. They didn't have vaccinations. So you can imagine what it must have been like. That was back in 1346. And that pandemic raged from 1346 to 1353. And St. Catherine served the poor and the sick during that time and inspired me with her acts of devotion to the sick and the dying. And she made a huge difference. She began at an early age to have mystical visions, at age 6, actually. Visions of our Lord Jesus, Mary, the saints, angels, and many celestial beings. And they continued to converse with her throughout her life. And of course, this ignited my imagination too. And I wanted to have such visions. And I was also inspired by the fact that in a time when most women by their families were sent off to be married and raise huge families. In fact, she was one of 25 children. So who's the saint there? I think it was her mother. She cut off all her hair at age 15, so she looked like a boy, and she fasted until she became so skinny that no man would want her. And then she declared her devotion to God. And she later went on to establish a monastery. She wrote prayers and books, and she was very influential in returning the papacy to Rome. So even the higher-ups listened to her, although she was a skinny little girl who looked like a boy. And I found that inspiring, too. She wrote a book called The Dialogue, and in that book, when she was in a state of absolute rapture, ecstasy, and bliss, she had a long conversation with God. And in that conversation, God told her, "You are all like trees of love. In fact, you cannot survive without love because I made you for love. And the greatest law, the only law you have to remember, is that you love God." And I remember those words during the pandemic. You love God. Your essence is longing for God. And Myrtle Fillmore, our co-founder, would agree with St. Catherine of Siena. And St. Catherine would agree with her. We're all in agreement about this. But sometimes we don't feel this longing, do we? Sometimes we deny it. But Myrtle said, "When our powers are placed aright, we shall direct our aspirations and ambitions toward God." So when we are thinking right-mindedly, when we are thinking correctly, when we're in our right minds, our focus, our energies will naturally go in the direction of God. It's our inheritance. It's who we are. And it's the most powerful drive in all of the universe. The longing for God is the longing for love because God is love. It's more powerful than any physical appetite. In fact, it is who we are. It's the only love there is. There is no other love. It appears in many different forms. The love of all creation, the love of brother and sister. But it's truly one love, is it not? The love for God. And Jesus also agrees and reminds us in the New Testament through Matthew that you shall love the Lord with your whole heart, your whole mind, and your whole soul. And we weren't told this as a warning or as a threat. Jesus told us this because it's who we are. It's our true identity. And when we connect to this longing for God, when we express it, when we embrace it, our lives transform and they become more fulfilling. We experience greater healing and happiness. So the key to our happiness is this longing for God. And I would like to ask you that question. And when I ask you this question, think about it honestly and truthfully. Do you experience a great longing for God? Are you, like St. Catherine, consumed by a love for God? Is your heart filled with yearning and burning for God? And that's what I asked myself during the pandemic. And the answer was yes, but no. I have to be honest. And the reason is a great fear. Because this force in us, this longing for God, is so overpowering, it's the greatest force in the universe. How could we not fear it? It's bigger than anything we could possibly imagine. So what happens is that we repress it. We push it down. And that results in a repression, a denial, and a distortion, ultimately, of the divine impulses that are always entering our superconsciousness. We are always being sent these divine impulses, and we'd like to respond with absolute love and longing for God. But what happens from the time we're 6, from the time we start school, the world kind of drums it out of us and sends us in another direction. We're sent on a worldly path, and we're taught to value another kind of achievement, are we not? A worldly achievement. I took a class not too long ago online by an author named Robert Perry, who greatly influenced me. He is founder of the Circle of Atonement and Course Companions, and writer of many books based on the principles of Course in Miracles. And he also talks about this great longing for God and says it's who we are. But what happens, he says, is it gets distorted. It gets pushed down, distorted, and then it reemerges as the possession drive, what he calls the possession drive. And the first way it reemerges is as the longing for things. And I think we can all relate to that. Amazon.com, anyone? Right? How many of you have spent maybe a couple, more than half an hour looking at things you might buy? It's called the acquisitiveness drive, acquisition. But it's actually, if you look underneath it, it's the longing for God. This longing for things is the longing for God. And what happens is that we imbue objects with this special meaning and significance. I know I did this once when I was in high school. I went to a concert in New York at an outdoor concert at a cathedral, and I saw this beautiful man playing a golden flute. And the most beautiful, magnificent, uplifting music came forth from that flute as it gleamed in the sun. And I thought, I want a flute. I must have a flute. And I learned to play the flute. And I took that flute with me everywhere. I took it to school, I took it to meetings, I carried it with me, and I imbued it with this special, almost godly significance. Have you ever fallen in love with an object? Yeah. And I think many of us have. And what it is, it's the longing for God. Just kind of re-expressed, reinterpreted. I know that we have seen boats with names. A lot of people name their cars. They give them names, human attributes, musical instruments. And the fact that we name things means we're giving them special attributes, godly attributes or human attributes. But they're just things, right? And if we study quantum physics, we know that there really isn't anything there, that it's just a bunch of molecules and mostly space. And we're directing our love toward these objects. So it's a little strange, isn't it? But it's really the love for God. And the second way that we express this longing for God in a distorted way is through possession of bodies. We all have different relationships, but sometimes in those relationships, we treat the other as merchandise, again, as objects. And we forget that we are not bodies, that we are spirit. And we fall into roles in which we expect the other person, the body, to do things for us. And if they don't do things for us, if their bodies don't do those things for us and fulfill those functions we expect, we get annoyed, and often we leave those relationships. He's not giving me what I want. That's not what I want. And we come to these agreements. I will cook and clean if you take care of the finances, et cetera, et cetera. We fall into roles, bodily roles. But this is not who we are, because we're not bodies. So it gets very confusing. Does it not? And we also focus on, and I know many of us can relate to this, over-focus on the appearance of the body. And this is also a distortion of the great longing for God. We over-focus on how we look, and we expect perfection in the way we present ourselves. And this drive for perfection in how we present ourselves is just this longing for God. Again, repressed, pushed down, and a little twisted, coming out looking like something else. And the third way that we repress and then distort this incredible longing for God is through our drive for knowledge, our drive for information. And by possessing greater knowledge, we tend to believe that we will get more attention, we'll have greater safety, and we'll be, therefore, worthier. We will have greater worth. So again, this is just the longing for God, and it's kind of buried in this drive for more knowledge, more degrees. Want to get another master's degree? How many do you have? Etc. And it also shows up in a reading obsession, which I have. How many books are you reading at once? 4 or 5 is usually the answer. So there's this thirst there. There's this restlessness. There's this angst. And it's longing for God. Again, it's just twisted a little bit. But it's still a beautiful thing. But is it totally harmless? Is it totally harmless? Should we just go along with this and accept, yes, these are all possession drives, and yes, they all conceal our love for God, and that's nice. I like knowing that. But is it really so harmless? I'm not so sure. So let's look at the effects of the possession drive. What happens is that it creates anxiety. Because we're not expressing who we are, we're not expressing ourselves as spirit, as divine ideas, as love, peace, and joy. We're expressing ourselves as bodies. It creates a little anxiety. It's like we're in the closet. We're in the closet. So come out of the closet. And it also creates a kind of compulsion, because nothing can satisfy us but the love of God. So we engage in compulsive eating. That's what I do. Compulsive eating, compulsive shopping, compulsive whatever. But that compulsiveness is the restlessness of the longing for God that needs to be expressed purely. It needs to be put out there so others can receive the benefit of it and we can change our world. And the third way is through depression. So if we start putting our faith and our values in objects, of course that's going to make us depressed, because that's not who we are. We're not physical or merely physical, are we? We are spirit. We are glorious spirits. We are children of God, and we have a divine destination. So what are we to learn from all of this ultimately? We know that we are not just bodies, we are not just objects. Therefore, we shouldn't channel all our energies, that superpower that we have. That longing for God is the superpower. We shouldn't channel it toward gathering more degrees, more information, more objects, more special relationships. What if we just put it out there? What if we just went within first and looked at it and saw it for what it is? Without denial, without repression, took it out, put it out there, beheld it, embraced it, and then shared it. I think our lives would be transformed. In unity, we believe that our thoughts and our desires create reality, do they not? There's the power of desire. So what would happen to our world? What would happen to your world if you directed that desire toward God and toward God alone. Your life would change radically because the attributes of God would show up. And the attributes of God are peace, love, joy, harmony, abundance, order. And all of that would show up if you just peeled off that mask that hides the face of the Christ. Take off that mask and look at who you really are. That gorgeous, radiant, all-powerful spark of divine energy. Put it out there. The way of mastery, which is a channeled work, very important at Unity Windward, has many spiritual lessons to teach us. And the way of mastery tells us that what you desire is of utmost importance. So desire then perfect union with God. Desire then to commune with God. Desire then to know God. Because if you do, your world will change. Our world will change. Right now, we're all kind of worried about the images we see on the TV screen. Images of attack, images of fear, images of confusion. And that's a collective thought, isn't it? It's a collective desire that we're tapping into. And if it's true, as Unity teaches us, that minds are joined, then every thought we have has the potential to change other thoughts. So all we have to do, really, it's that simple, is to change our thoughts from thoughts of fear, I will not fear what I see, to thoughts of love, because this is the fullest expression of the longing for God. And then, as we do that, ultimately, we can create heaven on earth. And so it is, and we let it be right here. Amen. And thank you.